To have you join us this evening. I know it's late for those of you on the East Coast, so thanks for staying up. Hopefully she'll keep you entertained enough to keep you awake through this, and hopefully she'll stay awake through this. She is joining us at 9 o'clock Eastern Standard or Eastern Daylight Time, so we are ever so grateful for the time that is being given by Karyn for this webinar, as well as her being willing to come to California on May 12th to do an all-day presentation on this topic that will provide a lot of opportunities for healing for those of you who are able to join us. Information will follow this on our website, but save May 12th, it's a Saturday, so that families can come. Teachers will be able to join us as well. Without further ado, I'm going to hand this off to Karyn, who will be just enlightening us with some great information. And I will be monitoring the questions, so don't hesitate to add those. Karyn, take it away, and please introduce yourself.
Sure. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for attending. I really appreciate this. I am honored that you wanted to see this and that you're watching, or that you may be watching at a later time. Thank you so much. So today we're going to talk about trauma and intellectual disabilities and about healing, which is really the most important piece. So what I'm going to do is talk about first the causes of trauma in folks with IDD, and then the effects. We'll go through some of the effects, and then we'll talk about healing. And since we only have an hour, I'm not going to get as in depth as I will when I come in May, but I really hope to cover as much ground as I can. So next, we have next slide. Will be, that's just me, and I have a couple of books out there if people are interested in some free materials that NADD was nice enough to publish at pid.thenadd.org. Okay, and next. So let's talk about the sources of trauma for people with IDD. So the Spectrum Institute, which is out where you are, did a wonderful, wonderful survey and great piece of research where they surveyed over 7,600 people with disabilities and asked them, have you been sexually, physically, or financially abused? And 70% said they'd been abused. Over 90% said it had been ongoing, and only 37% reported it to authorities. Why? Because everybody said we knew nothing would be done about it. This is the state, and it's terrible. Just in July, the Bureau of Justice Statistics Department reported that people with disabilities are 2.5 times more likely to be the victims of violent crime than people without disabilities. And it's 40% more likely that they'll be the victim from someone they know versus people without disabilities. So that was kind of a horrifying statistic that came in recently. Dave Hinsberger talks a lot about sexual abuse, as does Nora from the Spectrum Institute, Dr. Nora Baladarian, and she's just brilliant in talking about her work is so important in risk reduction. And Dave Hinsberger says it's 6 out of 10 males and 8 out of 10 females have been sexually abused by the time they're 21 with disabilities. And in many cases, it's been ongoing. So it's a terrible, terrible condition that we have where there seems to be some kind of target on the back of people, in particular with intellectual disabilities. And that's what I'm focusing on more so than developmental, but, or both. But really, I want to today focus a lot on intellectual disabilities. This doesn't mean that people don't heal and recover, but I think we have to face the reality that oftentimes folks with intellectual disabilities are targeted. There's a lot of aspects of trauma. Social trauma and bullying is quite severe. We're now realizing the effects of bullying, which is very real. We have many situations where we've seen children commit suicide. we had in Perry Hall in Maryland, we had a boy who was horribly picked on all throughout his freshman year in high school. And he, every day at lunch, a group of older boys would laugh at him and get everyone laughing at him. So, and he had a very troubled life, and he had difficult family situations. All summer he was just home, and he kept saying that if it happened again, he was going to shoot people. He told his one friend, and he came to school and he brought a gun in his backpack, and he said, if it happens again to this one friend, I'm going to shoot people. The friend didn't think he really meant it or that he would bring a gun. And he walked into the cafeteria. The boys started making fun of him. He ran back, put the gun together, started shooting. The boys were gone already, and he shot a kid with Down syndrome, of course, right? The kid's fine, the kid survived, but of course that was horrible trauma. But this boy was tried as an adult, and his life is ruined. And that was his trauma response to being bullied. It wasn't the right response, but it causes suicide, homicide. The effects of bullying are way more severe than we've ever realized. Now we're starting to see. Also, the effects of being excluded. And there was a study done, interesting study, where out of Duke University, Dr. Eisenberger did this with her research team, and she had individuals who are the participants hooked up to a brain scan so they could see which part of the brain was firing. And she told them that you're playing ball, cyber ball, with a mouse. You're catching the ball with a mouse in front of a computer with 2 other people in 2 other rooms. But really, it was a computer program that just had a certain pattern. So the pattern was the ball would be thrown to the participant, but then after a minute or 2, the participant would be excluded. And they just played very quickly and deftly with each other, and the participant was excluded. Every single participant's brain fired in the singular anterior cortex, where your brain would fire if you broke your foot. It's your pain center, your physical pain center. And so exclusion was experienced as physical pain. And we think about all the experiences of disabilities, and many, many exclusion experiences, many times when you're not included, you're left out. We all know what that's like, right? Like, I had a cousin who did not invite me to her wedding. And then I wasn't even invited to my uncle's funeral. I didn't even know he died till 3 months later. It's my family, we're very strange. But we all know what it's like. Maybe you don't have these extreme examples. I didn't invite her to mine either, just let me tell you. But that exclusion, when I heard that everyone was invited but me, that really hurt, right? We've all had those experiences. I worked at one job where they would have a party every Saturday, and on Monday they'd all talk about it, and they didn't invite me. Every Monday I would be like hurt. And I kept telling them, I'm so much fun. How is it that you're not inviting me? I am so fun. And finally they found that out at the Christmas party. But sad to say, I missed all those parties, and each time I had that little feeling of hurt. Just like when you're bullied, you have that feeling of, right? So now think about how many times folks have been called the R word who have a disability, and how does that impact you, or excluded. So these emotional sources of trauma are very real as well. And then of course there's the physical abuse, but more particularly, I'd like to talk a little bit about the trauma of institutionalization. And many older folks with disabilities have grown up in institutions and experienced horrible traumas there, and really suffered in many ways. And that's something not to be discounted, even if they're, okay, now you're in the community, everything's fine. People need healing. They really do, because those experiences have been devastating. Next slide. So now we are finding out about the effects of neglect as well. So, many folks have been neglected. So right now we see so many people who whose moms struggle with a drug addiction, and are born addicted to drugs. So in the mid-90s with the crack epidemic, many children were just born into situations where mom was a drug addict, and they were also born addicted. There's so many difficult things, and neglected. So a lot of neglect went on in those situations. And the Bucharest Orphan study, early intervention orphan study, was a really pivotal piece of research that showed us the effects of this kind of neglect. So they looked at 138 children. They divided them up. They were all in an orphanage, and they took half the children and they created a foster care system. They based it on the French model, which is where people are paid to stay home and nurture. In the American model, we actually don't let people, in most states, they don't let people do foster care unless they have a job, because they don't want people doing it for the money. It's America. But in France, they actually pay you to stay home. And so they took half the children, and they were put in that situation. Now, the children were already 6 months to 4.5 years old. Attachment theorists would say that much of the damage is already done. You know, and many of us know children who have been adopted and were in bad situations, maybe just for weeks or a few months, and yet have had trouble their whole life, even though they've had wonderful adoptive families, because of those early weeks being so influential, and months. But so they took children and who were already had a lot of trauma. And after 4.5 years, here are the results. Next slide. This is very important to me to see, because now the children left in the orphanage, 55% qualified as having some kind of Axis 1 disorder, either mood or thought disorder, whereas only 35% of the in foster care. So that's a big decrease of 20%. Emotional disorders, from 49% left in the institution to 29%. Behavioral disorders, 32% versus 25%. And of course, the control group are those children who were just raised in their biological family. That's the third column. Behavioral disorders are less because many children just shut down. So they don't have those severe behavioral issues because they're maybe dissociating, not present, just trying not to be there, which is often the effects of trauma as well. And here's the most important statistic for our field, and that is the average IQ. So the average IQ of those children who were left in the orphanage was 73 versus the children who were nurtured, 85. So almost half, if I don't know, statistically speaking, or may have been some outliers, but we can assume that at least close to half of the children in the orphanage qualified as having an intellectual disability, and way less of those nurtured had an intellectual disability. Trauma lowers IQ. Cognition is hurt. We don't operate at full scale on all cylinders when we've had a lot of trauma. People that I've worked with many people who I knew were really smart, but had such difficult lives and went through so much that they couldn't pass an IQ test. They couldn't function cognitively at their optimum, and yet you know how smart they are. I bet all of you know somebody like that. So the trauma itself is so impactful. Next slide. And we've seen that in so many studies. There's a theory that we have mirror neurons, and now people are questioning whether it's an actual neuron or more or less of brain function. But the way that we learn is that when we're at critical developmental periods, whatever stimulation we get from the environment, our brain gets wired up and responds. So when we smile at a 2-week-old baby, the baby's brain is wiring up as though the baby's smiling, even though the baby can't smile yet. So at 2 or 3 months, that baby starts smiling because that baby has watched you and their brain has fired as though they're the one doing it. Same thing with language. When we talk to a baby, the baby's brain is wiring up for grammar, for all kinds of connections, and then the baby begins talking when the time is right. They did a study where they looked at the brain scans of Chinese babies and American babies and compared them, and they were wired differently based on the syntax and the grammar. So, and none of them talked. They were just listening, and one was listening to Chinese, the other was listening to English. So it's very important that we get interacted with, and that's another source of trauma, when that proper interaction at the critical developmental periods doesn't occur. Next slide. And the other reality is that the face of disabilities has truly changed. As I was talking about earlier, there was a horrible crack cocaine epidemic. I was alluding to mothers who had drug problems. Well, in the 90s, late 80s, 90s, early 2000, crack just ripped through every major city, and many children were born with serious addictions. And it was devastating because there was a long-term study done that said, oh, they're fine after they get weaned off. Now, I know here in Baltimore we had many children at University of Maryland Hospital, at Johns Hopkins Hospital, many children who were born addicted, and that was horrible. So this one study was done. I had a friend who was a part of it, but they only followed those children for 2.5 years. So that was the big problem. If they had followed them into elementary school and throughout to high school and on to the rest of their life, they would have seen that actually the cocaine damages the brain very specifically. And that specific damage causes two major impairments. Number one is severe attention deficit disorder, like a pinball. So I don't know if any of you work with anyone who's maybe under 30, 32, and they are listening to you 1 minute, then distracted over here, then running out the door, then talking to someone, then back here, then what do I want? I want this, I want that, bing, 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 bing. But they're very socially aware. They know who's sleeping with who, and they know everything about pop culture. They know all the music. They know way more than the rest of us, but they can't finish a sentence. And it's very hard for them to learn new things because of that severe attention deficit. They'd rather have a behavioral issue than have you know that they can't do something because they're so socially aware, because that social part of the brain is not damaged by the cocaine. That's the first aspect, that's severe ADD. And then the second aspect is that they also have severe impulse control. So they'll go from 0 to 100 in about a half a second, and it'll be like boom, boom, boom. And all of a sudden they're running into the street, or they're in a fight when they were fine a minute before. This is a very different type of profile and a very different person than we worked with years ago. And they often don't respond to traditional behavior plans. My experience is when I set up a traditional plan and there's a big reinforcer, people often sabotage right before they're about to earn it. They sabotage themselves. And it seems almost purposeful. So many complex reasons why, but instead we have to build up a positive sense of self and have some success experiences and mastery experiences because they're not working for those rewards. I don't know if any of you had that experience. There's a similar profile now we're seeing with those children born addicted to methamphetamines. So that's similar with, especially we're seeing them come of age in Midwest areas, like throughout Texas. I saw this and heard a lot about it, although I haven't seen research yet. But anecdotally, children have a very similar profile. So, my guess is we might be seeing, unfortunately, children born addicted to opioids with a similar pattern. So there's bright spots of intelligence, social awareness, language, and the thing about language is often that they can express much better than they actually understand. So they can act like they know, they can say the right things, but not really be processing. So then staff will say to me, well, they know better. They know what they're doing, and look, they can write, they're smart, but there's certain mechanisms that are broken. And there's more and more people like that. And then oftentimes, next slide, we have the alcohol damage on top. And with that alcohol damage, the thing that the alcohol breaks, and you can see this profile where you have the flat area between the nose and the lip. And my area looks kind of flat, come to think of it. I wonder if my mother was hitting the bottle. I hope not. I could explain a few things. I've never really looked while I was giving that talk. But in any case, you know, the eyes are always half open, and we have that whole fetal alcohol, and that's a whole nother talk, and many people are far more expert in that area than I am. But what I do see and what I do know about is the combination of the alcohol and the drug exposure, which is something we see a lot. And those folks will have a hard time because of the alcohol. They cannot connect cause and effect. So what alcohol damages is your ability to sequentially reason. So there'll be that disconnect. So they'll do the same thing over and over again and not know why they're in trouble, or why is everyone mad, or I'm doing fine, because they can't sequentially reason. They can't see if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, and you're going to get everyone mad when you tease them, or whatever the situation. So that's a big deal. That's a big deal, because this is the new profile of many folks that we're working with now that have had that in utero exposure and would have been fine, right? So you can see the parts of them that, you know, would have been just perfect. So it's a devastating, devastating epidemic. Next. So the family system, you know, the rate of divorce. So, and I know we have a lot of families here, and my heart always breaks when I give this talk with families. I know many people inoculate their children with love. And believe me, love is the greatest inoculation, and yay for you. So, but the divorce rate is way higher with families where there's a child with a disability. And when a child has other manifestations, behavioral manifestations, issues, whatever, there's a lot of trauma. And what we don't always see or understand is how the trauma is not just with that child, the family has trauma. Sometimes we see families withdraw and feel like, you know, my in-laws don't get it, my sister doesn't get it, and I'm not going to go to that family reunion. I'm not going to go to Thanksgiving. You don't understand what it's like when my kid has a meltdown, and I feel judged, and that becomes its own trauma. So we cannot underestimate the impact on the family of raising that child, and all the stress and all the anxiety, and then also having difficulties with placements of adult children. And I run a moms group, and so much we have older moms and younger moms, and so much of what the older moms talk about and are you know, really struggling with is what's going to happen when I die. So the trauma is everywhere, and people need support. They deserve support. I think support groups are critical wherever you can find a support group when you are a family member. And also to give yourselves a break and understand that this has a giant impact. And it's not something you just, you know, buck up and get used to and keep going. It's devastating, and you need support, and you need to get help when you feel like it's just too much. So that's a reality too. Trauma impacts the family system. Next slide. So how does it work biologically? So we have, this is kind of a very simplistic model of the brain. I really should stop using it, but it's just so easy to use to describe. Like, we have our limbic system where the brain, our brain stem, and just the, just kind of responds, and they call it the reptilian brain because it just keeps things going, but it doesn't really process. Then we have our animal brain, which is the limbic system, and that's where our amygdala is, and our fight, it's getting late for me, fight, flight, or freeze system is, where the amygdala senses danger and then responds. And then we have our smart brain, our neocortex. So when we sense danger, the smart brain, which plans and thinks things out, shuts down, right? So let's say we're a baby and we touch a stove, and all of a sudden we're like, and we go screaming and running, and everyone's telling you to calm down, but you're screaming and crying hysterically, and you can't calm down, because the only way you can calm down is when you know you're safe. As you get older, it's the same. So if a kid is being picked on in school, rather than just walk away or tell the teacher, maybe all of a sudden he's wanting to fight because, like that boy with the gun, you just triggered me and I'm in danger, and the best response is to fight. You know, the best defense is a good offense. And a child may be fighting and may seem to be aggressive with some kind of negative behavioral tendency when really they're having a trauma response because they're traumatized. And I've seen this so much, and I really believe that about 99% of the aggression that we see is out of fear and is a trauma response, because the trigger is something that tells the brain that it's in trouble. And the smart brain, that neocortex goes offline. And the one part that can calm down that limbic system is the parasympathetic. So we have our sympathetic nervous system where the amygdala resides that shows you you're in danger. And then we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which will calm you down only when you feel safe. That's why I regret writing a lot of bad behavior plans where I told the staff that when this person is having a giant response, just tell them, you know, when they're throwing that table, oh, stop, put the table down, you're going to lose your soda. That's appealing to the smart brain. They're like, I don't care about my soda, and I'm going to throw this table right at your head. So I wrote bad programs that relied on thinking that it's the teachable moment. When somebody's having a trauma response and that yellow part of the brain is flashing, you're in danger, there's no rational thinking. Next slide. I have many stories, but I don't have time to tell them. I will tell them in the future, I promise. So we have that fight, flight, or freeze response. We also have attachment issues. Janina Fisher talks about how some people, when they feel like they're in danger, will go to shame, like, I'm sorry, and all they can do is apologize, even though they may not have even been responsible in any way. Or become very needy, I need you, and can't be calmed down because that neediness just overtakes them. Next slide. These are all trauma responses, and it's important for us to recognize that. You know, and Dan Siegel says people revert to the age that they first had trauma when they are in that trauma response. And I think it's important that we distinguish between a behavioral response, which may be a deliberate effort to gain something or whatever, and a trauma response, which is just that yellow part of the brain just flashing, you're in danger, and a person going into flight, like I'm running out the door. I worked with this one woman, she would run into traffic when she saw one person, one staff member. And we finally realized that she had a long history of abuse and institutionalization in a very bad institutional situation, that there must have been somebody who horribly abused her who looked just like that staff person, because she would put herself in more danger, which is what we often see. People will place themselves in more danger because their brain is telling them, run, do whatever you have to do to get out of this trouble. You're in serious danger. When the brain isn't always right, that amygdala is your emotional memory. It's not rational. The rational brain has gone offline. Next. So the amygdala actually becomes enlarged when you've had trauma experience after trauma experience. And interestingly enough, people with autism have a very traumatic day-to-day existence because of this constant bombardment of sights and sounds and difficulty interpreting language, difficulty, orienting, trying to focus on people when their brain is taking tons of pictures in every minute. Very difficult. So I heard Temple Grandin speak, who's so wonderful. I'm sure many of you have seen the HBO movie Temple Grandin, and she showed us a slide of her brain. And her brain had an enlarged amygdala and a shrunken hippocampus. Interesting fact, that is a sign of a very traumatized person. The brains of children who grew up in war-torn Bosnia were examined, brain scans. They were still alive. They did brain scans, and they saw that their amygdalas were way enlarged. And when when part of the brain is enlarged, another part shrinks to make room, and the part that shrinks is your working memory or your hippocampus, which makes it difficult to learn. Again, IQ gets lowered. Bessel van der Kolk replicated the study with children who grew up in gangs, in gang-infested areas, who were constantly seeing people killed and around danger. The amygdala is enlarged to the point where they're always thinking they're in danger, where it's constantly flashing. They're constantly being triggered and having these fight, flight, or freeze responses, or that neediness or that shame, all those things, depending on who you are. And I think it's time we recognize what trauma responses are and we treat them differently. Next slide. The most important thing is that people are safe. When they're activated, they feel unsafe and they're just responding from a very visceral place and they're not rational. So what we need to do is help them to get away from the trigger, to be safe, to be able to calm down, to know that they're going to be okay. It's not the time to teach them about what they just did wrong. It's the time to comfort, to reassure, to get them away from that trigger and that stimulus until they can be rational, and then you can discuss whatever. But it's all about safety when you're having a trauma response. Next. So hope changes everything. It's the most important thing. That's why we have to encourage people. And when we shame them, which of course nobody intends to do, but I did in the many mistakes I've made as a psychologist, one thing I did was try to always point out what people did wrong and what should you be doing now and what should you have done. And it just, people lost hope and they didn't feel safe with me anymore. But to give them hope, to let them know things are going to change, it's going to be okay, we're going to fix this, we're going to work things out, is so critical. Next slide. So I like to have this pyramid because a lot of times we're just dealing with the behavior without understanding that underneath these behaviors, it's the tip of the iceberg. People aren't doing this to do it to us or to get something all the time. Most time it's because of an emotion that's just bubbling up, that's just too much. And underneath that emotion is that trauma very often and past experiences. So that individual who's being teased may way overreact to teasing, but it's because they've been bullied for years and years and years, called the R word for years and years and years. No wonder they have this behavioral issue. No wonder they're exploding and really around that person keep going, just getting worse and worse, because their amygdala is flashing saying danger, 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 and what counts the most is helping the person get safe. Next slide. So also people develop somatic symptoms, physical body symptoms. A lot of times people have stomach issues because that amygdala triggers the brain saying, it fills up the brain with chemicals, the adrenaline, the cortisol, and then the stomach acids begin turning, and people often have gastrointestinal issues that no one can find anything wrong. They have physical aches and pain. Bessel van der Kolk wrote a wonderful book called The Body Keeps the Score, where he talks about the emotional pain is actually stored in the body, and that's why body work is so wonderful. So talking about healing, yoga, we have great results with the use of yoga. Yoga in classrooms before school, kids who did yoga every day, their behavioral incidence went way down. We run at the ARC Baltimore, where I work, we run something called the Healing Center, and we do yoga, dance, and the dance is so therapeutic, the yoga is therapeutic. Some folks don't have a lot of movement, so we do chair yoga with them. We have music therapy as well, and singing. We do as much, with the body, with the whole self as possible. A lot of artwork and art therapy and getting your hands in things, and we've seen great results. People really heal that way. Next. See, now I'm talking about the good stuff. Oops, here's a sad quote, but it will get better. So Nichiren Daishonin says, he's a great Buddhist scholar from the 1200s who taught people chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. And he said, if you try to treat someone's illness without knowing its cause, you will only make that person sicker than before. So sometimes in having a purely behavioral approach to what's a trauma response, we've actually worsened the situation without even realizing it, because we weren't addressing the root cause of the real issue. Next. So I think it's so important. This is my favorite thing to talk about. If you take anything with you, please, this triangle, I think we've just been organizing the way we do, the way we support individuals around this, and we found this to be so effective that when there are difficulties, when there is trauma, there's 3 ingredients that are needed in order for people to recover. And they're all really critical. Number 1 is safety. People need to feel safe. People need to know that they're safe. Number 2, and that safety is emotional too. So we're training staff now to be emotionally safe, to give positive messages, to tell people they like them, we train people in active listening. And a safe person is someone who listens to you. So we look at that level of emotional safety as well as physical safety. It's really important. Connection. So that connection with other people is so really pivotal. So a study was done with vets in Iraq, and they saw that the vets who had the most, they looked at vets who actually went through the same traumas, and some developed PTSD and some didn't. And they found 2 factors. Let me put it this way. The 2 factors were, 1, the closeness, the love, and the degree of friends and family. So those who did a lot of Skyping, a lot of FaceTime, and had a great support network back home were way less likely to experience trauma. And then 2, the relationship they had within their unit. Those who said that everyone has each other's back and were really close were much less likely to develop PTSD than those who said they couldn't trust the people that they were with in their unit. 2 really critical factors. Let's translate that into the world of intellectual and developmental disabilities. Many people are very isolated. What they need most are friends. Friends, family, support, that emotional support, and friends who aren't paid. Really a wonderful thing. I run a singles club at the Arc Baltimore, and we try to make so many matches. We have some successes, we have some failures, but we are not stopping. Because, love is everything. And friendship, too. We really help people create friends that last. And we really believe, and we all know as humans, right? Friendship inoculates you as well as helps you to heal. And then finally, empowerment. And here's where I love person-centered thinking. And I love it in every aspect. And it's so critical. But more important than ever is that people have some kind of sense of power over their life. Real choice and not fake choice. Not an IP or a plan that sits in the book all year, but your meeting was wonderful and everybody's so happy because we set great goals. And then it goes and sits on the shelf and you go back to your regular life. But actual control over your life, actual choices. There's a really important concept that I need to make a slide for, but it's called agency. And Bessel van der Kolk introduced it when he talks about healing from trauma. And a big piece of healing is being able to be an agent in your life, being able to act on your life, being able to exercise your choice, even if it's just a small thing. It doesn't have to be everything, but somewhere that you feel control, that you feel like you're moving things forward and you have an effect on your environment. It's a really critical piece of healing. And really, really important, particularly in the realm of disabilities where people are often very passive, the passive recipient of our help. That model does not really engender healing. To be an agent, to be active, to be affecting things is how people heal. Next. So, Judith Herman talks about the core of trauma being shame, that people often turn it on themselves. Here's where I've worked with many people who were horribly abused and then they cut themselves, right? So I'm turning it on myself, or they sabotage themselves whenever they're about to be successful. So, I think that it's really important also to therapeutically address, the building of the sense of self and help people to move past shame into healing. And so I really believe in his therapeutic interventions. So not only do we need that support in schools, in residential settings for adults, that we train staff differently. We train staff to be emotionally supportive, to be emotionally safe, to facilitate relationships and connections, and to help that individual to be empowered. And we also, I think, add that therapeutic piece, which is very important. And Judith Herman, who's really one of the founding mothers of trauma, and traumatology. That's a new term now. I think it's old, actually. I just found out about it, though. I'm always behind the times. But, you know, she really talks about that, you know, healing and thriving is so critical, and that blaming the victim further traumatizes people. Next slide. So we did it quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, but we did a study at the Arc of Baltimore on EMDR, which is a type of therapy from Francine Shapiro that she originated, addressing trauma specifically. And it stands for eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing. And we took 8 people with severe trauma histories who all had active PTSD, all of them really manifesting lots of symptoms. And every single one of them, after 1 year of EMDR, no symptoms. Every single one of them. I have many stories, but people who were chronically aggressive, like this one guy, I was just with him yesterday. What's today? No, Friday. And he lost jobs because he was so easily triggered, because he'd been horribly abused throughout his life. And he would get into fights on the jobs and lose the jobs. For 3 years since this study now, he hasn't had any aggression. And he was having a meltdown because one of his housemates moved out, and he really missed him, and he was crying. And normally everyone said, oh, you know, this guy gets, you know, he just blows up, you better be careful. And I knew that he hadn't done that for 3 years, even though he had a bad reputation that followed him from many years. And so I just said, oh, do you need a hug? And he ran over and hugged me and cried, and we cried, and then he hugged his other housemate, and then he was fine. And everyone was like, I can't believe it. But they haven't been with him for a while. They only knew his reputation from years ago. He completely changed as a result of that EMDR. It is phenomenal. And I have many other stories. But next slide, I'm not going to tell them. I'll tell them in the future. Another very cool study was done where they trained staff in mindfulness. And they had a residential program from kids that were like 15 to 25, and there were lots of restraints and lots of incidents. And when I saw, oh, mindfulness training, I thought they trained the folks that they were serving, who all of them had a lot of trauma and had many behavioral problems. Instead, they trained the staff. So they did a 12-week program in mindfulness where they taught the staff, instead of to respond to the incident, to stop, to check in, you know, notice their breathing, notice their heart rate, see how they feel, take a minute, step back, and then respond. And restraints went from 3.5 to 4 every week to 0. That's the next slide. Amazing results, like phenomenal, because the staff were trained in those soft skills. So training staff in active listening, training staff in mindfulness, training staff to be aware of their own responses, and to be that safe person who can say, hey, we're cool, don't worry, walk with me, talk with me, let me help you, instead of going to restraints, you know, which I believe are re-traumatizing, or getting into that power struggle, many situations that escalate. So I think we have to train staff differently, and that's a big part of healing, is getting a different paradigm, and that trauma-informed paradigm, which helps us to look at behavior as often a trauma response, and to be able to have that compassion and that support that helps that person to feel safe, calm down, move forward. Next slide. Another piece that I feel very strongly about, wrote a book about this, NADD published it, is positive identity development. And I feel like a lot of folks, the critical thing for many, many individuals with particularly intellectual disabilities is that identity. Because next slide, they found out when everyone else was figuring out who they were figuring out who they weren't. Oh, I'm not going to get married. I'm not going to, or they were told that. Hopefully they are and will. But I'm not going to get that good job. I'm not going to college. When adolescence is the time when you develop your sense of identity, when then you figure out who you are, they were finding out who they weren't. So Erik Erikson says that you need to resolve that conflict of who am I, that identity in adolescence, in order to be able to really move forward to a rich and full adulthood. And if you don't resolve it, you can't really be, you know, fully empowered as an adult. But I believe it's even worse than, he says it's identity versus role confusion. I believe in our world, in intellectual disabilities, it's a identity versus a negative identity. You know, so that negative, like what I'm not, kind of like in the old days when we would develop pictures in a dark room and you'd see the opposite, like, well, I'm not this. So I believe it's really critical part of the healing, in addition to the therapy, the safety, the connections, the empowerment. People have to have a sense of self, the agency. People have to have that sense of who they are, and real positive identity. Right? Even if I'm the one that's good with animals, or I'm the one that really cares about old people and I visit people in the nursing home, just a sense of who I am makes all the difference in the world. We think about ourselves, right? That sense of mission or purpose. When, like for me, I changed a lot when I had kids, because I had to clean up my behaviors, not because anybody gave me a reward for it, but because you can't be a mother from jail. Oh, this is bad, this is on tape now. But you know what I'm talking about. So I had this sense of purpose because I had a new identity as a mom. So I changed my behaviors. I was somebody, and I was somebody's somebody. I've also seen a lot of folks change with disabilities when they had a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a husband or a wife, because I'm somebody's spouse. I make a difference. And that sense of identity means everything. It means everything. Next slide. See, what matters is how you see yourself. Next slide. And Daisaku Ikeda, a wonderful philosopher, there he is with Nelson Mandela. He said, ultimately, happiness rests on how you establish a solid sense of self or being. Look at Nelson Mandela, so much trauma, being in prison for 27 years, but he had that sense of who he was and what his purpose was and what his identity was. So he came out stronger, better, changed the world as a result. I believe everybody has that potential once they get that sense of identity and sense of self. You know, go through that healing process and then get that strength from knowing who you are. Next. So I'm going to talk briefly about the power of positive regard. So Bob Rosenthal did a study where he had graduate students working with mice, and this is kind of silly, but he told the students, well, half of you have the smart mice, this half of the room is the smart mice, put a sign up, smart mice, and then he had another sign, dumb mice, and they had to run the little rats through the mazes. They really were rats, but they look like mice. I had to work with them too when I was a graduate student. They're actually not that fun, but they're a little bit cute. But when they bite you, it's not that good. They don't bite, they don't really have teeth, but you know, kind of. Anyway, don't let me get caught up in that. The students who thought they had the smart mice, those mice ended up running 2 to 3 times faster through the maze. Not because first of all, there's no IQ test for rats or mice. But the students tried harder because they said, this mouse is smart. He meant to turn when he ran into that wall. Where the ones who had the dumb mice, they did really badly. And they said, you know, yeah, this mouse is just lazy and stupid. Put him back in the cage and give him some food. So that's my husband. Hi, Steve. So so the mice that were really smart weren't smart at all. They were just treated better and they responded better. And this holds true with humans as well. Next slide. So Carol Dwek did a study that would probably not pass today in an ethics board, but it was very important because she showed us so much. She divided children who all scored as the same IQ scores and grades, right? They were all the same. She divided them up and she told one set of teachers, you have gifted and talented kids. And she said to the other set of teachers, these kids have real problems learning. And the kids, just within a matter of months, where the teachers thought they were gifted and talented, went ahead a grade level. Some went ahead 2. Like, they did amazing. And the kids where the teachers thought they had learning problems, either stayed the same, or went backwards. Amazing. We know this to be true, right? If you think about if you've ever had a boss, I had this one boss who thought I was an idiot. Whenever he came around, I would say stupid things. You just kind of regress when you know someone doesn't think very highly of you or is looking down on you. And I had this other boss once who thought I was a genius. And every time I talked to her, I'd have some brilliant idea because I just responded to her positive regard. Next slide. Everybody's like this. This is just a human thing. So how can we train people? Actually, Daniel Kish is a blind person, and his mother believed in him so much. She said when he lost his sight, I don't care what happens. You can do anything any kid can do. So he taught himself. Next slide. This is what he taught himself. Look at him. He's riding a bike. He did it through echolocation. He makes sounds, and he figures out where he is through that because he said, my mother told me, don't think of yourself. You don't worry about being blind or having a disability. You can do anything your brother can do. Just figure it out. Because she believes so much in him. Next slide. The power, now he teaches other blind people to do this. Now, quite frankly, if I had a relative who was blind, they're on a cliff. I don't know if you can see that. And they're hiking on a cliff and they're all blind. I would say, don't go with Daniel Kish. Don't sign up for that class because it looks pretty dangerous to me. But nobody's ever died, and they all learn to use that echolocation. So now he's helping others. Next slide. So some wonderful studies are done, and I'm going to wrap up with these studies because they're so relevant to all of you. They looked at people who had lots and lots of trauma. There was about 30 years ago, they just studied all kinds of people with terrible, difficult traumas, who actually ended up doing really, really well in their lives, who succeeded, who, like Oprah, who just went on to become one of the richest women in the world and so brilliant and fantastic. And they said, what's the difference? What made the difference? And what they found was that those people who really overcame everything against all odds all had somebody in their life who believed in them. And it wasn't necessarily a parent. It was often a neighbor or somebody at the Boys and Girls Club or a guidance counselor or a teacher, and they weren't always there for a long time, but they saw them and they said, wow, you're something. You should go to college, or you're really good at art, or whatever it is. That person was able to convey an unconditional belief in the individual who was struggling and give them hope and strength and courage. And that's what we need to really train people in doing, right? If we could get the aides and teachers and staff to get that soft skill of belief, how powerful is that? And if you think about your life, if there's been someone who's believed in you, that person has been so critical. And a lot of times we've moved way past that person, but we look back on those mentors or just those people that saw us and recognized our potential and how they changed us in such a positive way. So we can do that. Next slide. We can do that. We help people be in the here and now. Key to healing. Hope, courage, encouraging people so that they have courage, and supporting them in every way for their benefit and their growth. People do heal. There is post-traumatic growth. There is recovery. But we have to understand the trauma in order to be able to facilitate that. And I think that's really key. So thank you. Thank you so much for your time. So I've left 4 minutes for questions. I know that's not a lot.
And we're ready to take questions. You can type them in if you have questions. Wasn't she wonderful? I know everybody's clapping, but you can't hear any of us or them. And Karyn's going to be here May 12th. It's so exciting. Gloria says, great presentation. Thank you. What do you think are the best resources for family members to help those with trauma? My son is on the autism spectrum.
Well, I recommend 2 things. Number one, I think it's so helpful if you can find a support group. And I've known some people who have started support groups when they couldn't find it with other families with children with autism, and that helps a lot. Of course, I know you're already getting services and accessing resources because That's what parents are geniuses at and amazing. But that emotional support is really important. And I've also known other people to get family therapy as a family, which I also recommend.
And we have room for a couple more questions. If you want to find out more information about what's available in our community and more information, we'll be posting the events that Karyn's doing in South Dakota on our website as well so that you can participate in those webinars. But go to www.php.com and you will find a lot of resources and information. Wow, they're pouring in now. Okay, message of hope, courage, and belief speaks to the heart and does not require any extra dollars, just a change in our mindset. Much appreciation from Tina down south. Gloria, let's see, they're coming in so quick now I can't keep up. Is there a way to access the slideshow? I would love to present this valuable information to my coworkers. I work at Regional Center of Orange County, and I know this presentation will be so helpful.
Well, we can have the webinar, right?
The webinar is going to be available online, so yes, indeed. All right, next, do you think birthing trauma plays a part in their emotional well-being later on in life?
Many people believe that, and in fact, there's a school of therapists doing EMDR about the birth experience and trying to process that trauma. So there's a lot of people that I respect who say yes.
Okay, and Brenda says, thank you, wonderful presentation. Another writer asks if there's any books that you recommend.
There's the Judith Herman book, Trauma and Recovery, is wonderful. I think Bessel van der Kolk. Oh, and you know, a great book. Bruce Perry wrote The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. I highly recommend that. That's a great book.
Thank you. It seems that trauma wires the brain in a negative way. Can treatment help rewire the brain in a positive way?
Definitely. That's why it's so important.
My daughter is 12. She has a poor self-image. How can I instill confidence in her? Loved the presentation.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, that's, you know, if you can find something that she's good at, you know, even if it's, you know, that she visits the shelter and helps the animals, or that she, whatever it is, one thing where she has a mastery experience, art, anything that you can find, that helps so much.
And another asker is, how do you find people trained in EMDR? Oh, and maybe you should say what that is again.
Yeah, eye movement reprocessing desensitization. And so that's, there is, if you go on the EMDR IA website, I'm pretty sure it's still that, there are therapists listed.
Thank you. And finally, to try to stick to our time frame here, how would you help the individuals that are nonverbal to find out about the source of their frustration for staff to help them?
I know, that's a great question. Well, I'm a giant believer in assistive technology, and we're working very hard at my job to try to get as many folks connected with iPads and ways to communicate as possible, and also understanding that everybody has their own language and they express their trauma in their own way with language that is theirs, even if it's not words. So learning their language and helping with assistive technology, I think, are really critical.
Well, thank you. I know it's 10 o'clock your time, and for many of the other people who are on this webinar, Karyn, you're awesome, and we can't wait to have you in California.
And you are too. Thank you, Truth.
Thank you so much. All right, good night, everybody. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.